I sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, staring at him. His breathing was steady, his chest rising and falling beneath the thin blanket. He looked peaceful, but I knew the moment he woke up, peace would be the last thing either of us would feel. George, my husband, my love, the father of my children. And yet, as he stirred, groaning softly, I had this horrible feeling like I was about to talk to a stranger. His eyes fluttered open. He blinked a few times, his gaze sweeping the room. The small wooden dresser, the old curtains fluttering against the open window, the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. His expression shifted, confused, lost. His hands gripped the blanket, knuckles white. Then his eyes landed on me. He frowned.
"Who are you?"
I almost laughed. Almost. But the way he said it, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't playful teasing like he used to do when he'd pretend to forget my birthday. This was real. Whom am I? I let out a breathless chuckle. Come on. Nothing. Not even a flicker of recognition. I leaned forward, studying him, searching his face for something, anything, that told me he was still in there. What are you talking about? It's me. I tried to make him understand that I'd traced the lines of his face 1,000 times before, kissed every inch of his skin, memorized every scar and freckle. But the way he looked at me now, like I was nobody, his frown deepened.
"I don't know you."
My mouth opened, but no words came out. A strange, hollow feeling spread through my chest. What, are you joking? His jaw tensed, his fingers curled into the blanket.
"Who am I?"
My pulse kicked up. Come on, George, what is going on? Is this some kind of prank? He swallowed hard, looking down at his hands like they didn't belong to him.
"I can't remember anything."
The room suddenly felt too small. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to make sense of what was happening. You fell, I said, my voice softer now. From the terrace. You hit your head. The doctor said you were fine, but I think you have some kind of memory loss. He stared at me, his face blank.
"Memory loss?"
You don't remember anything? Nothing at all? Silence. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the wooden floor. I'm calling the doctor. I grabbed the phone and dialed, pacing as I explained the situation. The doctor arrived within few minutes, his wrinkled face calm as ever while he checked George over.
It's temporary. Sometimes it happens. Just have patience. He will be all right.
Patience, right. Because it was just so easy to be patient when my husband, my George, was looking at me like I was a stranger off the street. After the doctor left, I sat back down beside the bed. George was staring at the ceiling, his hands clasped together on his stomach. I'm your wife, I said, my voice steady. His head turned toward me, slow, careful.
"I don't remember you."
A lump formed in my throat. You will. Something flickered in his eyes. Hesitation, doubt, maybe even guilt. He shifted slightly, like he was testing the weight of those words. And then, after a long pause, he sighed.
"Okay."
That one word, that simple little okay. He didn't believe it, not yet, but he had no choice. I forced a smile, ignoring the stinging behind my eyes. Come on, let's get you up. Maybe moving around will help. I reached out my hand. He stared at it for a second before finally taking it. His grip was familiar, warm, solid, but as I pulled him to his feet, I knew. The man standing in front of me wasn't really my George, not yet. But I would bring you back, no matter what, I said to George. His expressions were tensed, like he didn't want it to believe me. The morning air smelled like wood smoke as George and I stepped outside. He walked slowly, taking in the village like he was seeing it for the first time. In a way, he was the narrow dirt paths, the rows of small wooden houses with tin roofs, the way the wind carried the scent of pine from the nearby hills. I stayed close, watching him. He was quiet, his brows pulled together, his fingers grazing the rough bark of a tree as we passed, like he was searching for something, maybe a memory, maybe just a sense of belonging. This is home, I said gently. We belong here, George. He didn't answer. His gaze traveled to the forest's edge, then up to the hills beyond it. I wondered what he was thinking. If any part of this place felt familiar, if any part of me did. Then I heard the quick patter of footsteps. Papa, a small voice, high-pitched, excited. Before George could react, two tiny figures darted toward us. James, our 7-year-old, with his untamed brown curls and scraped-up knees, and Eve, our 5-year-old, her dress slightly crooked, her little hands outstretched. They stopped in front of him, eyes shining. I looked at George. He looked at them. "Do you remember them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated. "They're our children, James and Eve." Eve didn't wait for permission. She threw her arms around George's waist and squeezed tight. James followed, his small hands gripping his father's shirt. George stiffened, but then, slowly, carefully, his hands lifted. One rested on James's head, the other on Eve's back. Something softened in his face. I watched as his shoulders relaxed, as a quiet sigh left his lips. "They love you," I said. He stared me, but he didn't answer, but he didn't need to. I could see it in the way he held them, even if he didn't remember. After a moment, I touched his arm. "George, you should rest. You'll need your strength. We still have to work for a living, you know." He pulled back slightly, looking at me.
We're poor.
I gave him a small, sad smile. "Yeah, but I was thinking of starting some work. Something that could make things a little easier for us, if you're okay with it." George tilted his head, considering.
I don't remember enough to say anything about that. But if you want to work, you should.
I blinked. That wasn't the answer I had expected. "Before, you never let me," I said carefully. "I always dreamed of working, of earning something for us, but you wouldn't allow it." His lips parted slightly, his expression flickered, regret maybe, or just confusion.
I'm sorry. Maybe I was different then. Maybe I've changed. Or maybe I don't know what to say. But if you want to work, you can.
I exhaled, something warm blooming in my chest. Without thinking, I leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. George tensed. Just a little. I pulled back, studying him. "What's wrong?" His jaw shifted.
Nothing. I'm just trying to remember you. Trying to feel like you're my wife. But it's empty.
I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. "We'll get there," I promised. "Just give it time," he exhaled.
I don't know.
I squeezed his hand, then let go. "Maybe you should rest." He didn't argue. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the house. His steps slow but steady. I watched him disappear inside, watched the door close behind him. And then I left. The bus ride to the city was quiet. The hum of the engine, the chatter of strangers, it all blurred together. At the bank, I went through the motions, counting bills, checking balances, stamping forms. The work was simple, repetitive, but my mind was somewhere else, with George, with his empty gaze, with the strange mix of hope and sadness that had settled in my chest. By the time I got back to the village, the sun was dipping low. The house stood still and quiet in the dimming light. Something felt off. I stepped inside. The bed was empty, the blankets untouched. George was gone. The moment I stepped into the room, my stomach twisted. No, not like that. It was more like a knot being pulled too tight, making it hard to breathe. George was gone. He was right there when I left, resting in our home, and now he had vanished. I ran straight to the field where Eve and James were playing. My babies, my whole world. They were kicking a half-flat ball around, their laughter floating through the warm afternoon air. But I had no time to soak in the moment. "Have you seen your father?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, making both of them stop and look up at me with wide eyes. They shook their heads. No, my pulse jumped. "Are you sure? Did he say anything? Did he leave with someone?" James frowned, pushing his small shoulders back, trying to act like the little man of the house. "No, Mama, we've been playing here the whole time." Eve tugged on my shirt. "Is Daddy lost?" I forced a smile, but my insides were screaming. "No, baby, he's just out." I ruffled her hair, even though my hands were shaking. "You two stay here, all right?" I turned on my heel and ran. I searched everywhere, through the narrow dirt paths between the houses, past the rows of crops in the fields, even behind the old well at the edge of the village. Nothing, no sign of him. I grabbed the arm of a passing woman. "Did you see my husband?" She squinted at me. "Tall man? Looks a little lost." "Yes, did you see where he went?" She shook her head. "Haven't seen him since this morning, dear." I thanked her and kept moving. My feet ached, but I didn't care. I had to find him. Then a voice behind me, low, almost amused.
Looking for him?
I whirled around. A man I barely recognized stood there, arms crossed. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with a slight smirk on his face like he knew something I didn't. My breath caught. Yes, do you know where he is? He shrugged.
Saw him heading towards the bus stop.
I didn't wait for another second. I ran. By the time I reached the small, dusty bus stop, my legs were burning, but I barely felt it. A bus was just leaving, kicking up a cloud of dirt as it rolled down the road toward Old Jersey. My chest tightened. Had he gotten on that bus? I climbed into the next one, paid my fare with shaky hands, and rode straight to the city. Old Jersey was loud. The noise of the streets hit me like a slap. The honking cars, the chatter of people, the hum of life moving too fast. It was a world apart from our quiet village. I searched every street, every alley near the bank where I worked. I checked the marketplace, the food stalls, even the tiny park with the old wooden benches where people sat to escape the rush of the city. He wasn't there. Frustrated, I pulled out my phone and dialed Clara. The moment she picked up, she didn't even say hello. What? My husband is missing. Silence. Then, what? How? I exhaled, pressing my fingers against my forehead. I don't know. I came back home and he was gone. I searched everywhere, but no one's seen him. Clara sighed, but it wasn't impatient. It was the kind of sigh you let out when you're already thinking of 10 different possibilities. Joe, you shouldn't have left him alone. I know, I swallowed. But I had to work. Clara clicked her tongue. Well, now you have to find him. Did you check the police station? Not yet, should I? Wait until evening. If he doesn't come back, then report it. I bit my lip. All right. I hung up and took the next bus home, my nerves raw. When I walked through our front door, my breath hitched. George was standing right there, like nothing had happened. I froze for half a second before my body moved on its own. I grabbed his arms, eyes scanning his face. Where were you? His expression was unreadable.
I was wandering nearby. I needed fresh air.
Fresh air, that was it? I pulled back, my mind racing. I searched everywhere. You weren't here. George's face didn't change.
What are you trying to say?
I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to calm down. I was worried about you, that's all. I didn't know what I expected from him. Maybe a softening of his features, some recognition, a sliver of the man I once knew. But he just stood there, like a stranger wearing my husband's skin. I took a step forward, letting my lips hover inches from his, giving him a chance to close the distance. He didn't. Instead, he stepped back.
I need time. I'm sorry. I can't.
I swallowed hard. The rejection stung more than I thought it would. What? I'm your wife. What's wrong?
I know, but I think we need to reconnect. Like a new start.
A new start. It shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. But I forced myself to smile. Okay, as you wish. I grabbed a small phone from the table and placed it in his hands. At least take this. If you go anywhere, call me. I get worried. He hesitated before taking it.
All right.
I forced myself to keep smiling. Hungry?
Yeah.
I'm serving dinner. I called the children in and we all sat around the table. Simple food, rice, some boiled vegetables, bread, nothing fancy. But it was enough to fill the silence. George poked at his plate.
These are my favorites?
I let out a short laugh. Well, we don't have much, but I started working at the bank today. We'll upgrade soon. He hummed.
I see.
We ate, and for the first time that day, things almost felt normal. Almost. That night, after the children went to bed, I locked the door and climbed into bed beside George, or at least I tried to.
Are you sleeping here?
His voice was quiet. I raised an eyebrow. Where else would I sleep? He hesitated.
Do we have another room?
I sighed. Just the kids' room. But if it makes you uncomfortable, I'll take the couch. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought he might stop me, but he didn't.
I will sleep on the couch.
My throat tightened. Not a chance. You need a good night's sleep. I'll manage. I turned before he could argue, walking over to the couch and lying down, curling up with a thin blanket. A long pause, then his voice, soft in the dark.
Are you sure?
I forced a smile he couldn't see. Good night, husband. The smell of coffee drifted through the room, pulling me from sleep. I rubbed my eyes and turned over, expecting to see an empty space beside me. Instead, George stood by the small counter, pouring coffee into 2 chipped cups. His back was straight, his movements careful, as if he were still getting used to being here. He turned, his eyes meeting mine.
You are awake.
I sat up, pulling the blanket around my shoulders. You're up early today?
I feel better.
He said simply, walking over to hand me a cup. I took it, wrapping my fingers around the warmth. Thanks. George sat down on this chair across from me, staring into his cup.
I should be thanking you instead. I don't even know you, and yet you care for me.
A small smile tugged at my lips. You're my husband, George. You're my soul. He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly.
Why don't we go somewhere for a few days? Maybe if I meet people, I'll remember faster.
I hesitated. If that's what you want, but I just started my job at the bank yesterday. I'd have to take leave. He frowned, thinking.
Then I'll go by myself.
The words hit me like a sharp gust of wind. I set my cup down, watching him. Come on, George, that's not safe. You need me. His jaw tightened.
I'm a grown man, Joe. I don't need to be babysat.
I exhaled slowly, choosing my words carefully. I'm not saying you can't take care of yourself, but you're still healing. You don't know what's out there. You don't know who is out there.
I will be fine.
He insisted. Then I'm taking leave, I said firmly. George shook his head.
No, we need money. Work until I can find a job.
I pressed my lips together. He wasn't completely wrong, but something in me didn't want to let him wander off alone.
You are stubborn.
He smirked slightly. You just figured that out? I sighed. What did you do before? For work? His brows pulled together.
I don't know.
You worked at a showroom, I told him. His expression flickered with something, curiosity, recognition.
Where?
In the city, I said. He set his cup down.
Then I should start working again.
I stared at him. You need rest, George. He met my gaze.
No, I'm going today.
That's a bad idea. He leaned forward slightly.
Why don't you want me to go?
Because I don't want anything to happen to you. He let out a humorless laugh.
Or because you don't want me to remember?
His words stung. I stood, closing the space between us. Please, George, trust me. His expression softened for a second before hardening again.
I don't know why, but something in me tells me I don't belong here.
I stiffened. That's just because everything is new again. He stood up, grabbing his coat.
I'm going.
I stepped in front of the door, my heart hammering. Please don't. His fingers brushed my shoulders as he moved me aside, firm but not rough. Then he stepped outside. I followed him. George, please.
Stop following me, Joe.
I clenched my fists. Then let me come with you.
I don't want company.
I exhaled sharply. What's your problem? He didn't answer. He just kept walking. I trailed behind him secretly, keeping my distance. He got on a bus, and so did I, one that followed the same route into the city. When we reached Old Jersey, I watched him step inside the showroom. Then everything happened too fast. A group of men rushed toward him. One pressed a cloth against his face. George struggled, his body jerking, but within seconds, he went limp. They carried him off. Panic surged through me. I didn't think. I moved. I followed them into the woods, my breath coming fast. When they stopped, I let go of my human form. My body stretched, bones shifting, skin burning as fur replaced it. My claws sank into the ground. I attacked. I didn't stop to count how many there were. 4, maybe 5. It didn't matter. They came at me, but I was faster, stronger. One by one, they fell. I stained the earth, mind tensed with the scent of fear. When the last one collapsed, I turned back. George lay on the ground, unmoving. I transformed back into my human form, kneeling beside him. George, wake up. His lashes fluttered. Then his eyes met mine. He was in my lap, his face inches from mine. I could feel his breath against my skin. I was so relieved I could barely breathe. Then I remembered. He didn't want me. He didn't trust me. I pulled away and stood up. George blinked, still dazed.
Did you save me?
I turned, my voice quiet. I always will. He sat up slowly.
How did you... I mean, there were 5 of them, Joe.
I looked at him. That's not what matters. What matters is, who were they? He rubbed his forehead.
I don't know.
Or maybe you do, I murmured, but you just don't remember. A shadow crossed his face.
Yeah, that's possible.
I crossed my arms. Be careful, George. His head lifted.
Where are you going?
I hesitated. Home, because I know. You don't love me the way you used to. His eyes locked onto mine.
Joe, I'm confused. I don't know who I am, but that doesn't mean I'd just leave behind people who love me.
I held his gaze. You need time, but I can't wait forever. His throat bobbed. I've already waited a long time for you.
What do you mean?
I mean, you're not just lost, George. It's like you don't want to remember. His expression darkened.
That's not true.
I took a slow breath. You don't believe me. You don't believe in us. You don't believe in anything. He stared at me. For the first time, he had nothing to say. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I walked through the empty streets, my feet heavy with exhaustion. The sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and pink, but I barely noticed. My mind was stuck on one thing, George. I didn't know where he was, I didn't know where he was going. And maybe the worst part? I wasn't even sure if I knew him anymore. The thought made my chest ache, but I pushed it aside as I reached my front door. The house felt different, colder, like something was missing, like someone was missing. I grabbed my phone and dialed Clara. Hello, she answered, her voice sharp. Clara, I sighed. He doesn't remember anything, and I left it all up to him. He'll decide what to do now. A pause. Then, what, are you mad? How could you? I can't keep chasing him if he doesn't want to remember me, I said, rubbing my temple. He's just a stranger now. That's nonsense, Clara snapped. Let me see what I can do. I didn't have the energy to argue, so I ended the call. I stood there for a long moment before I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait around. If George was going to start over, then so was I. By morning, I had packed everything. Clothes, toys, old pictures I couldn't bear to leave behind. The kids didn't understand, but I told them we were moving to a new home, closer to my work, a fresh start. Old Jersey wasn't much different from where we'd lived before, but it felt like another world. The apartment was smaller, but it was enough. The bank was just around the corner. It was practical, logical, everything I needed to move on, or so I thought. That evening, my phone rang again. Clara. Joe, did you find him? I hesitated before answering. He'll do what he wants. Don't you dare, she warned. You know this isn't right. This is not what you were supposed to do. I tried, Clara. He's stubborn. I can't force him to remember me. Clara exhaled sharply. Fine. If you won't do something, I will. No, I said quickly. Please don't. I'll find him. We'll see, she muttered before hanging up. I stood there gripping the phone, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I needed to find him. I left the apartment and walked straight to the one place that made sense, the showroom where he used to work. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of polished wood and new fabric filled the air. A man stood near the front desk, adjusting a display of suits. Excuse me, I said, walking up to him. He turned and gave me a polite smile.
Yes, Mom, I am, William. How can I help you?
I'm looking for my husband. He used to work here. William's expression shifted slightly.
What is his name?
George. Something in his face changed. Recognition? Pity? I wasn't sure.
George?
He repeated.
Yeah, he was here.
My pulse quickened. Where is he now? William sighed.
He came by earlier. Said he lost his memory. He was looking for information about himself, trying to figure out if he really worked here.
I swallowed hard. And?
We didn't find any records of him. He must have worked at a different branch.
I exhaled slowly. Of course. He'd gone to the wrong place. Do you have any idea where he went? I asked. William shook his head.
No, Mom. Why not just call?
He won't answer, I admitted. We had a misunderstanding. William gave me a knowing look but didn't press. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed me a card.
If he comes back, I will let you know.
I took it, running my fingers over the numbers printed on the front. Thank you, I said quietly. As I stepped out of the showroom, the streets of Old Jersey stretched before me, filled with people going about their lives. Somewhere out there, George was doing the same, and I had no idea if he'd ever come back. The morning felt emptier than the night before. The sun peeked through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room, but I didn't feel its warmth. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at my phone, debating whether to call the showroom again. Maybe George had shown up, maybe he hadn't. Either way, I had to try. I inhaled sharply and dialed the number. After a few rings, William picked up.
Hello?
It's Joe. I came by yesterday, looking for my husband. My voice felt smaller than usual.
Oh, yes, I remember.
He paused, probably checking something.
He has not come by.
I swallowed, forcing down the disappointment. All right, thanks. I ended the call and sat there for a moment, gripping the phone. My mind was restless, circling back to the same thought. Where was George? I stood up, took a deep breath, and decided to start searching again. After a quick shower, I pulled on my jacket and stepped outside. The streets were already buzzing with life. People rushing to work, children running with their backpacks, shopkeepers setting up for the day. I walked past familiar places, scanning faces, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but he wasn't there. The weight of it settled in. Maybe I should have stayed with him, forced him to remember, made him understand that we belonged together. But then another thought pushed through. It hadn't been entirely my decision to leave. George had been the one who walked away first. He wanted to figure things out on his own, without me. That meant, whether I regretted it or not, this was already set in motion by him. Still, I had to find him. By the time I got home, exhaustion dragged at my limbs. I barely had time to sit before my phone rang. The bank. I hesitated before answering. Hello? Joe, you didn't come in today. Everything okay? I closed my eyes. I wasn't feeling well. I'll be in tomorrow. They didn't press, just told me to take care, and ended the call. Almost immediately after, my phone rang again. Clara. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what she had to say, but I picked up anyway. Hello? I found him, Clara said, her voice calm, but there was something underneath it. Something unreadable. A strange sensation ran through me. Where? That doesn't matter, she said. I'll take care of it. I'll bring him to you. My fingers tightened around the phone. What should I do? Wait, she said simply. You will bring him? My people will. Then she hung up. I stared at the phone, unsure of how I felt. Relieved? Nervous? Both? The waiting was unbearable. I paced the room, checked the time every few minutes, tried to distract myself, but nothing helped. And then, before the evening could settle in, my phone rang again. William, I snatched it up. Hello?
Your husband is here.
I didn't wait for another word. I ran out the door, barely locking it behind me, and rushed through the streets toward the showroom. My breath was quick, but I didn't care. I just needed to see him. When I arrived, my eyes found him immediately. George stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, looking around like he wasn't sure what he was doing there. His hair was slightly messy, his shirt wrinkled, but he still looked like the man I once knew, the man I still loved. I walked up to him.
Joe?
His eyes met mine.
What are you doing here?
I folded my arms, trying to steady myself. I was just making sure you can live without me. Something in his expression softened. Then, to my surprise, he smiled.
I missed you, Joe.
I felt my breath catch. You missed me?
Yes, I did.
Then why didn't you come to me? He looked down for a moment, then back at me.
I thought about calling you, but I kept thinking, I've already made you suffer. Why do it again?
I stepped closer. I'm your wife, George. He hesitated, searching my face.
But it feels like we're strangers.
I nodded. Maybe we are, but that just means we get a new beginning. His eyes stayed on mine, studying me. Then finally he spoke.
Can I come with you?
I exhaled, the tension in my chest loosening. You must. We left together, heading toward the new apartment where our children were waiting. When we arrived, I opened the door and stepped aside, letting him take it in. It wasn't much, just a small space with enough room for us to start over. George looked around.
How many rooms?
I rolled my eyes. Not this again. He smirked.
All right.
Fine, I'll take the sofa,
There's no need.
he said, his voice lower, softer. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Clara. I let it ring. George glanced at me.
Is it important?
Not at all, I said, slipping the phone into my pocket. It's just a friend. His eyebrows lifted slightly.
A friend? Which friend?
I hesitated. Sophie. Her name's Sophie. I didn't told that it was Clara. Because what if George recognized Clara? George didn't press. Instead, he stretched, then looked at me.
I am starving.
I smiled. Let's eat then. I went into the kitchen, prepared a meal, and set the plates on the table. Before I could call him over, he sat down himself, grabbing a fork. I watched for a moment, something warm settling in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, we could be normal again. I sat across from him, and for the first time in a long time, we ate together. After dinner, the kids ran outside to play in the small backyard, their laughter drifting in through the windows. George leaned back in his chair.
Let's get some rest.
I gave him a small smile, and we walked to the bedroom. He stepped onto the bed like it was the most natural thing in the world, stretching out with ease. I hesitated for a second, then slid in beside him. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly, he turned toward me. His fingers brushed against my arm, his warmth so close it made my skin tingle. I felt my breath hitch as he reached out, pulling me gently toward him. I felt my face grow warm, my pulse skipping a beat. He pressed a kiss to my cheek, his lips barely grazing my skin. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper.
Make love.
A deep warmth spread through me. I swallowed. You should recover first, I murmured, my voice barely above a breath. But if you want... I leaned in, pressing the softest kiss to his lips. Just a touch, a reminder that we still belonged to each other. I was too nervous, like I hadn't kissed him earlier. George smiled against my lips.
You're right. I should recover first.
Then he pulled me close, his arm resting around my waist, his body warm against mine. He was too close to my skin. His arms were holding me. His chest were pressed against me from behind.
Good night,
he murmured. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I just let myself sink into him, into the warmth of his embrace, into the quiet comfort of knowing that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. The night passed in silence, but in his arms, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, safe. I woke up to the quiet rhythm of George's breath against my back. The morning light slipped through the curtains, casting a soft glow over his face. His arm rested just above my stomach, warm and steady, like he had never left. I traced my fingers lightly over his chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. The quiet moment settled over me like a blanket, making it easy to pretend that nothing had changed, that there was no distance between us, no forgotten memories, no hidden truths. Then his breathing shifted. Before I could pull my hand away, George stirred and kissed my shoulder, slow and lingering. His voice was thick with sleep as he murmured,
Let's make it.
A heat climbed up my neck. I turned my face slightly, smiling, but my voice came out softer than I intended. You need rest. Like I didn't wanted it so early. I wanted to make him really love me from inside, but I was sure he was doing these just to make me normal. Before he could say anything, my phone rang, breaking the moment. I glanced at the screen. Clara, again. I declined the call. George's eyes followed my movements.
Who was that?
One of my friends. It's nothing. His gaze stayed on me for a moment longer before he reached for my phone.
If it's nothing, answer it.
I hesitated. George held out his hand. With a forced smile, I unlocked the phone and passed it to him. He pressed redial, then set the phone against my ear. Clara picked up on the first ring. Her voice cut through my hesitation. What the hell is going on? Where have you taken him? My fingers curled against the bedsheet. I was about to inform you. You're interfering with my work, Joe. You know that, don't you? First you left him alone, and now when I told you that I will take care of it, you again took him. Tell me, are you doing it properly? I glanced at George, who was watching me closely, his expression unreadable. It's not like that, I said carefully. Everything is fine, don't worry. Clara's voice sharpened. Where are you? I forced a small laugh. Goodbye, Clara. And I hung up. George studied my face.
Everything all right?
Of course. His eyes stayed on me for a second longer, like he could hear the lie buried under my voice. But then he leaned back, stretching.
Let's eat outside tonight, just us.
I nodded. Sure. But inside I didn't want to. The warmth of his invitation clashed with the unease rolling under my skin. I should have been happy. He was here. He wanted to be with me. But Clara's words sat like a stone in my stomach. As I got dressed for work, George followed me into the kitchen. The air between us had shifted. I could feel him watching me. Then his arms slid around my waist from behind, and his lips brushed against my neck. He slowly dragged my dress from the left shoulders and kissed on my skin gently. My heart was breathing so fast, I was too nervous. I liked it, but it was too early. I didn't want to stop him, but I can't also take it. A quiet gasp slipped out before I could stop it. George's voice was low, playful.
We should have more kids.
I turned in his arms, raising an eyebrow. Really? I asked. I was afraid that is he hinting that we should make it soon? He grinned.
Yeah.
I smiled back, but inside a weight pressed against my ribs. Why now? George kissed the corner of my mouth.
I'll be waiting for you.
I forced my thoughts aside and leaned into him. Okay, dear. As I reached for the door, George pulled me back. His lips met mine in a slow, unhurried kiss, like he wanted to make sure I remembered it all day. I felt him like never before. I always wanted this, but something told me from inside that it was too fast. But why? When I stepped outside, my hand still tingled where he had touched me. But even with that warmth, something inside me wouldn't settle. I walked to the bank with questions swirling in my head. Was this really a fresh start, or was I just pretending? The phone rang while I was at work. Clara, again. I hesitated before answering, pressing the phone to my ear. Where are you? Her voice was sharp, cutting straight to the point. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice calm. I'm with him. Everything is all right, don't worry. You should have told me. I exhaled slowly. I won't repeat it again. I won't let him go anywhere this time. Clara was quiet for a moment, then she said, I see. I'll be watching you, and him. I know. Her voice dropped lower. Be conscious. Maybe you won't get another chance. The line went dead. I put my phone down, pressing my lips together. Clara never wasted words. If she was calling, it meant something was brewing. But right now, George was my priority. After work, I hurried home. The moment I stepped inside, I saw him waiting by the door, dressed and ready. He looked different, stronger, more sure of himself. I smiled. How are you feeling? His gaze softened.
Being loved.
Before I could react, his lips found mine, slow and deliberate. Warmth spread through my chest, but I hesitated. He pulled back, studying my face.
What?
I shook my head, smiling. Nothing. I'm just happy to have you back. His eyes searched mine.
I am trying.
That simple sentence hit deeper than I expected. Then he asked,
So, where are we going?
I took a breath. I know a good restaurant. His face lit up.
Do you remember where we met the first time? That restaurant? Daniel's restaurant.
He said, watching me closely. I forced a smile. Of course, our old memories. I felt so confused. How did he recognize that restaurant so fast? Is he really getting back his memory? George chuckled.
Do you remember how we danced? I had no idea what I was doing, and you had to balance both of us.
I swallowed. The memory felt foggy, like a dream slipping away before I could catch it. Yeah, that was a great night. But actually, I didn't have any idea what he was telling me. His smile faded slightly.
It wasn't a night. It was daytime. Don't you remember?
I forced a laugh. Oh, right. Of course it was a day. Something about this conversation unsettled me, but I didn't let it show. Let's go, I said quickly. George reached for my hand, his grip firm, almost protective, as we stepped outside. As we walked, a question gnawed at the back of my mind. How was George remembering so much so fast? A week ago, he barely recognized me. Now he was recalling small details, things I barely remembered myself. George caught me staring.
What's wrong?
I smiled. Just looking at you, George. He squeezed my hand.
Here we are.
I looked up. My breath caught in my throat. Daniel's restaurant. The place looked familiar, like something I had seen in an old photograph. The brick walls, the string lights hanging from the ceiling, the faint smell of grilled food, and the waiter greeted us instantly. "Hello, Madam Joe and sir. It's a pleasure to serve you again." I blinked. "You know me?" The waiter gave a polite smile. "Of course, madam. You've visited this restaurant hundreds of times." My throat felt dry. "Is that so?" I murmured. George placed a hand on my back.
Joe, what's wrong? This is our place.
I forced another smile. "Of course." George pulled out a chair for me.
Let's get some drinks first.
I sat down as he ordered 3 drinks. I frowned. "We're only 2 people." He grinned.
We're 3. Come on. How can we not invite my best friend?
A slow, creeping unease spread through me. "Your best friend?" I repeated. George nodded.
You know him well, don't you?
"Obviously. But did I?" He smiled.
He is on the way.
I gripped the edge of the table, forcing my face to stay neutral. Who was George talking about? Who was I supposed to remember? Then a man approached us.
Joe, how are you?
His voice was friendly, confident. He smiled like we had known each other forever.
It's Tom again.
Waiting for my reaction. I kept my face calm. "Yeah, we're doing well." Tom and George hugged like old friends. Then Tom turned to me.
Joe, why don't you both come to my house for dinner tomorrow? It'll be fun.
I scrambled for an excuse. "We have some work," George cut in smoothly,
No, we don't. We'll definitely come.
as my stomach tightened. Who was Tom? Why couldn't I remember him? Is George playing games on me? Or I had a memory loss just like George. What was wrong with me? Then Tom tilted his head slightly.
Joe, how's Clara?
A cold wave washed over me. I felt my face go pale. George turned to me.
Joe, he's asking you something.
Tom's gaze was sharp, observing me carefully. "She's fine." Tom nodded.
I haven't seen her in so long. Let's visit Clara in the evening tomorrow, then head to my house for dinner. What do you say?
George smiled. Panic crawled up my spine. I was being pulled into something I didn't understand. "I have work," I tried again. Tom chuckled.
Come on, Joe. Clara is your best friend. Let's go.
George glanced at me.
I think he's right. We should visit Clara.
I clenched my jaw. Okay then. For the next hour, Tom kept asking me questions. Small things, details about our past, memories I should have had. But every time he brought something up, I came up blank. George was watching me closely. I felt like I was sinking, like the walls were closing in. I forced a laugh. "I'm not feeling well. I should go." George touched my arm.
Honey, it's okay. Let's go.
As we stood up, Tom hugged George, and then Tom hugged me. But when he hugged me, Tom's voice followed me.
You are not that clever, Joe. Good night.
I asked, What did you say?" Tom smiled and he said,
I was telling you that you are not that clever. You thought you could make me stay away from Clara?
I freeze. I got afraid of something. Then Tom said,
You know I like her. Please let me try at least.
I forced a smile. I got relaxed because I thought that Tom was warning me, or he may had found out something about me. Or maybe he was supposed to, but he changed his words at the last moments. I didn't turn around. The whole way home, my mind raced. Something wasn't right, and I was running out of time before they figured out something.
Are you all right?
George's voice broke through the silence. I sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my arms as if that would chase away the unease creeping up my spine. I just need some rest. George didn't say anything. He got up and walked out of the room. A few minutes later, I heard him in the kids' room. The soft rustling of blankets, a quiet sigh. He was checking on them. When he came back, I asked, Are they asleep?
They are, and they've already eaten.
I exhaled slowly, trying to push the lingering tension out of my chest. George pulled his shirt over his head, tossing it onto the chair. I glanced at him. Feeling hot? Should I turn on the fan? His lips curved slightly.
Not at all. I'm feeling hot after watching you.
A warmth spread across my cheeks. I smiled, shaking my head. You're impossible. I felt loved, but at the same time, a stranger fear in my mind was blinking again and again. George walked toward me, slow and deliberate. his eyes never leaving mine. When he reached me, his fingers brushed the buttons of my shirt. He unfastened the first one, then the second. My breath hitched, my chest going ups and downs as he pulled the fabric off my shoulders, letting it slip down my arms. His gaze traced over me, lingering on the lace of my innerwear, the curves barely hidden beneath. His fingers trailed from my collarbone down to my chest, then lower, his touch leaving a trail of heat on my skin. "I thought you weren't in the mood," I murmured. His lips brushed against my shoulder.
I am in the mood.
The air between us felt different, intense. George's hands moved with slow, deliberate care, like he was relearning me. His lips followed his hands, pressing against every inch of skin he touched. I felt his breath against my neck, his warmth surrounding me. My heart wanted more, but somehow I was feeling little nervous, or maybe too nervous. "You're so warm," I whispered. He lifted his head, meeting my gaze.
Do you love me?
His question took me by surprise. "Of course I do."
Then why do you seem hesitant? Every time I get close, you act like this is new. Like you're falling in love for the first time.
His fingers traced my jaw, tilting my face up to his. A nervous, forced laugh escaped me. "That's ridiculous."
Is it?
His voice was quiet, unreadable. I forced a smile. "Just forget it." He studied my face for a moment before sighing.
If you're not in the mood, we can stop. Put your shirt back on and rest.
I hesitated. "I don't mind if you—"
No, it's fine. Rest.
I felt an odd twinge of guilt as I pulled my shirt back on and lay down. George climbed into bed beside me. His body was warm, familiar, safe. I closed my eyes. I realized that I always wanted this. George extremely close to mine skin. But when he really does it, I always gets too nervous for it. I was unable to handle it. It always felt like it is the first time. Then I realized that I shouldn't have stopped him from loving me. He must doubt in me. So I turned toward him and kissed his lips, and then I removed my shirt, and then I placed his fingers on my chest. Then it worked just as I wanted. Then George kissed me in back. Then I asked him to go lower. Then he did. George kissed my hips. I felt it so deeply. I held his head and pulled him away. But then I realized that if I pulled him away, he may doubt. Then I pulled him toward me. He opened my bottom wear and kissed between my legs. Then I felt so sleepy, like I didn't want to sleep, but I can't hold it. Last thing I remember is that George removing my underwear from my thighs and his fingers scrolling between my legs, and then I slept. And then, when I woke up, everything felt wrong. The first thing I noticed was the cool air against my skin. I wasn't wearing anything, not even my shirt. I bolted upright, clutching the blanket to my chest. George was lying beside me, bare, his arm resting casually over his stomach. Panic crawled up my throat. I yanked the blanket around me, standing up so fast my legs almost buckled. I grabbed my clothes from the bed, my hands fumbling to put them on. George stirred, blinking up at me.
What's wrong?
My voice felt stuck in my throat. "What happened last night?" A slow, lazy smile spread across his face.
You don't remember?
My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" George sat up, running a hand through his hair.
We slept together, Joe. What's the big deal?
I felt lightheaded. "No, I wasn't in the mood. I remember telling you that." He let out a short laugh.
And then you changed your mind.
I shook my head. "No, I didn't."
Does it matter?
His voice was calm, casual, like this was nothing, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Yes." George frowned, watching me like he was seeing something he couldn't quite figure out.
Why do you act like you're my girlfriend, not my wife?
His words landed like a slap. I stared at him, my mind scrambling for something, anything to say. George sighed, rubbing his face.
Joe, we're married. Even if we did, what's the problem?
I pressed my lips together. Nothing. Without another word, I turned and walked into the bathroom, shutting the door behind me. I leaned against the sink, gripping the edge so tight my knuckles ached. Nothing was wrong. And yet, I didn't feel like myself. I closed the bathroom door behind me, pressing my back against it. My hands felt clammy. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. I didn't want to do this, but I had to. My fingers trembled as I reached for the small test kit tucked inside the cabinet. I opened the box, my movements careful, mechanical. I had never done this before. It felt different. The weight of last night hung over me like a storm cloud. I followed the steps, my mind running in circles. Why couldn't I remember? Minutes crawled by. I stood by the sink, staring at the test like it might change if I looked long enough. But it didn't. The result was clear, negative. A breath of relief escaped me, but it didn't last. If I wasn't pregnant, then there was no explanation for the missing pieces in my memory. The thought unsettled me, but I pushed it down. I washed my hands, splashed cold water on my face, and tried to collect myself. When I stepped out of the bathroom, the smell of coffee greeted me. George stood by the counter, 2 steaming mugs in front of him. His shirt was still off, his back slightly turned as he stirred in sugar. "You made coffee?" I adjusted the belt of my robe, making sure it was tight. He turned, holding out a mug.
Yeah, figured you could use it.
I took the cup, fingers curling around the warmth. I didn't sip it right away. George studied me.
You okay? You look tensed.
I forced a smile, one I hoped looked real. "I'm happy, actually." I let out a small laugh, light and easy. "I just took a test. It's positive. I'm pregnant." The words tasted strange. George's face lit up.
Are you serious?
"Yeah."
Wow, that's amazing.
He set his coffee down and pulled me into a hug. His arms wrapped around me, strong, secure. His chin rested against my hair, his warmth seeping into me. I hugged him back, but my stomach was in knots. I had lied. The test was negative, but now I was sure. I had slept with him last night, and it sent me shivers down my spine. It sent me thudding in chest. It sent me nervousness, fears, strange fears I couldn't explain. I needed time to settle this. But before I could sort through my thoughts, George spoke again.
We're visiting Clara this evening.
The words knocked the air out of me. I pulled back, looking up at him. His smile softened.
We're going to Clara's fortress.
My hands gripped the coffee mug a little tighter. But I have work. I have to go to the bank.
You can still go. Just come home a little early.
I searched for an excuse, something that wouldn't sound suspicious. I'll see what I can do. George picked up his coffee again, taking a slow sip.
If you don't make it, Tom and I will go without you.
I went still. No, I said too quickly. George raised an eyebrow.
What?
I swallowed. I mean, you don't have to go alone. I'll come early. We'll all go together. He gave me a look, like he was trying to figure me out. Then he nodded.
Okay then.
I smiled, just a little, to keep the moment smooth. But inside, I was unraveling. Clara. I didn't trust her. And if George went alone with Tom, I had no idea what she would do. I finished my coffee, dressed quickly, and left for work. The moment I stepped into the bank, I reached for my phone and called Clara. She answered on the second ring. "Hello?" I didn't waste time. "Who is Tom?" A brief pause. Then in that smooth, honeyed voice, she said, "Tom, he's George's best friend." A strange feeling crawled over me. How did George find him? Clara let out a soft chuckle. "I don't know, you fool, but remember, if George finds out anything, you'll have to pay for that. Is that clear, my lovely Joe?" I tightened my grip on the phone. My throat felt dry. "I know." There was a shift in her voice, something darker. "I don't like people who get in my way. Finish him." My blood went cold. "Who, Tom?" "Yes." I pressed my lips together. My pulse thrummed in my ears. "I can't," I said quietly. "You'll have to do that. But don't. I'll make sure he doesn't get in your way. I'll manage." Clara hummed, amused. "And how will you manage George if he finds out?" I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us. Then slowly I said, "I think George is a good man." Clara's tone sharpened. "And you think I'm his enemy, don't you?" I hesitated. "No, it's not like that, but I think you're a little crueler than you need to be." A low laugh. "Yes, I am, because I'm Clara. I don't want to be the heroine, Joe." Then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, gripping it tightly. Clara was dangerous. I had always known that. But now I wasn't just worried about myself. I was worried about George, and I had no idea how to stop what was coming. I stepped inside the house, shutting the door behind me. The familiar scent of home wrapped around me like an old, worn-out blanket. But today, it brought no comfort. My mind was tangled with worry. George walked toward me, his face lighting up like he had been waiting for this moment all day. Without a word, he pressed a kiss to my cheek. His lips were warm, and for a fleeting second, I let myself sink into the feeling.
So, how was your day?
I forced a small smile. It was okay. He studied me for a moment, as if trying to read between the lines. Then he said,
I told Tom to be ready. I think he's already waiting for us.
My mind twisted, not with fear, not with nerves, but with the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I didn't want George and Tom anywhere near Clara. Every instinct in me screamed that it was a bad idea. I had tried everything to make George drop the plan, but his determination was like a river cutting through stone, steady, relentless. He wanted answers. And once George set his mind on something, there was no stopping him. I managed a weak laugh. George, are we really doing this? I mean, don't you think it's... He cut me off gently.
Joe, I know you're worried, but trust me, it's time we meet her.
His voice was calm, but firm. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't changing his mind. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. Fine, let me just go freshen up. Without waiting for his response, I walked toward our bedroom. As soon as I was inside, I let my shoulders drop. My reflection in the mirror looked just as troubled as I felt. What do I do now? I whispered to myself. How did George know that I'm worried? Did he got something? I needed a plan. A way to stop this from happening. Slowly, an idea formed in my mind. It wasn't perfect, but it was my only option. I took my time getting ready, slipping into a dress that I knew George liked. A soft blue one that hugged my figure just right. I curled my hair slightly at the ends, letting it fall over my shoulders. If I had to play a game, I'd play it well. Just as I was about to tell George to call Tom, a knock sounded at the door. I hesitated before pulling it open. Tom stood there, arms crossed, his eyes sharp as ever.
Joe, ready?
Plastered on the brightest smile I could muster. Yes, I'm so excited for this. Tom didn't move right away. His gaze flicked over me like he was searching for cracks in my act. He didn't trust me. I held his stare, refusing to waver. Before he could say anything, George clapped a hand on his shoulder.
Tom, let's go.
We stepped outside, and the night air greeted us with a quiet stillness. As we walked, I felt George's eyes on me. His gaze was soft, searching, like he was trying to figure me out. I glanced up at him. George, everything okay? His lips curled into a small, knowing smile.
Now everything will be all right.
Something about the way he said it sent a ripple through me. I didn't know what he meant. We reached the edge of the forest, the road stretching ahead of us. The trees loomed in the distance, their shadows deep and endless. It was time. I let my steps slow just enough to fall behind them. Then, without a sound, I slipped into the trees. The darkness swallowed me whole. Shifting was effortless. My bones stretched, my muscles tensed, my senses sharpened. Then I howled, loud. A call meant only for them. As expected, George and Tom rushed into the forest, searching for me. I watched them from the shadows, their footsteps crunching against the leaves. Then I struck. I lunged at Tom, my claws slicing through the air. I held back, making sure my strikes were light, just enough to instill fear. Tom stumbled back, eyes wide. Then something I hadn't planned for happened. Tom's body twisted, his form shifting. Fur rippled over his skin, his bones cracking as he transformed into a werewolf. I barely had time to react before he moved, his movements sharp and practiced. I turned and ran, shifting back into my human form. I looped around the trees and stepped out from the opposite direction, panting as if I had been taken. "George!" I cried out, my voice shaking. "There's something in the woods. It grabbed me. I couldn't stop it." George rushed to me, his hands gripping my arms. His eyes searched mine frantically.
Are you hurt?
I shook my head, pretending to catch my breath. Then I saw Tom in his werewolf form and gasped. "It was him," I pointed. "That thing, it took me." George quickly shook his head.
No, Joe. That was something else. This is Tom.
I let my eyes widen, feigning shock. "Tom?" I whispered. "Oh my God. George gave me a reassuring smile.
Yeah, he wouldn't hurt us. He's my best friend. He was protecting me from a rogue werewolf while we were looking for you.
Tom transformed back into his human form, his expression unreadable. I took a step back, making it look like I was processing the revelation. Let's just go home, I said, trying one last time. Maybe today isn't the best day for this. But Tom stopped me.
No, Joe. Now that you know what I am, you don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here to protect both of you.
I forced a smile. Of course, but George cut me off.
No buts, Joe. With Tom around, we have nothing to fear.
I swallowed my frustration. Tom had ruined my plan. I should have known he'd see through it. Now I had no choice. I had to go to Clara's place with them, and I knew deep down that by stepping foot into her world, I was walking straight into my own destruction. But there was no turning back now. So with a calm face and a storm inside me, I started walking toward Clara's place, George and Tom right beside me. The road stretched ahead, dark and quiet except for the sound of the horses and carriage wheels rolling over the uneven path. The closer we got to Clara's fortress, the heavier my body felt. My hands felt clammy against my dress, and a strange wave of unease settled over me. I'm really not feeling well, I murmured, pressing my palm against my forehead. I think I'm sick. George turned to me instantly, his face etched with concern.
My darling, what happened to you?
His fingers brushed over my wrist gently, his warmth soothing, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside me. Before I could say anything, Tom leaned forward, his sharp gaze cutting right through me.
Maybe she just needs a change. She's stressed. Don't worry, Joe. You'll feel better after visiting your best friend, Clara.
He said it with an easy smile, but I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. I forced a smile, hoping it would be enough to convince him. But deep inside, I knew I was in trouble. Tom wasn't buying it. He was sure I was hiding something. Not just from George, but from him, too. And George, he had been changing. The past few days, I could feel him shifting, the walls around him slowly lowering. For so long, he had pushed me away, but now it seemed like he was trying to accept me. But what if this visit ruined everything? What if this was the moment that changed it all again? Tom's voice pulled me from my thoughts. Let's go. I tightened my fingers in my lap, my nails pressing into my palm, and watched as the fortress came into view. George exhaled sharply.
We have been here before, haven't we?
His tone wasn't just curious, it was almost certain. Of course, Tom replied casually. I swallowed hard. As we reached the gates, 2 guards stepped forward, blocking our path. One of them narrowed his eyes.
Who are you? I'm Tom, this is George, and she is Joe. We're here to see Clara. We're her friends.
The guard studied each of us before glancing at his companion. With a small nod, he sent the other guard inside. A tense silence filled the air as we waited. George glanced at me, his brows slightly furrowed, but before he could ask anything, the guard returned.
Queen Clara had allowed you to enter.
George's head snapped up.
Queen?
His voice held a mixture of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Tom let out a chuckle.
Yes, George, she is a queen.
George said nothing. As we stepped through the grand gates, my chest tightened. The fortress was stunning, large, elegant, and well lit with golden chandeliers that cast soft shadows along the stone walls. Every inch was carefully decorated, every detail perfected. But none of it brought me comfort. George's attention was on the architecture, his eyes scanning the walls and ceilings like he was trying to remember something. When we reached the garden area, Clara appeared. She moved like she owned the world. A black Gothic gown hugged her body, shimmering faintly under the torchlight. The deep neckline exposed her heavy chest, but it wasn't just her beauty that caught attention. It was the way she carried herself. Every step was calculated. Every glance was dominant. Her eyes landed on me first, piercing through me like she already knew what I had done. Tom spoke first.
Clara, nice to meet you.
Clara gave him a slow smile. Same here. Come with me. George stepped forward.
Hello, Clara.
Her eyes flicked to him, her lips curling just slightly. Hello, George. I held my breath as she turned to me again, the weight of her gaze pressing down on me. Inside the dining hall, the table was already set, overflowing with rich, decadent food. Clara sat at the head, her queen's chair towering over the rest. Please, she said smoothly. Sit, my friends. Tom leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully.
So how are you doing?
Clara smiled. I'm doing very well. George glanced around before settling his eyes on Clara.
You are beautiful. And this place, it's beautiful too.
She tilted her head slightly. Thank you. Tom tapped his fingers against the table.
Clara, do you remember the first day you met George?
I could see anger and fear in her eyes. But Clara was pretending to be dominant. But the question made her frustrated from inside, she knew very well. That why Tom had asked this to Clara. Clara's smile deepened, but there was something cruel hidden beneath it. How could I forget? Her eyes flicked to me. Joe and George were so close. I was attending their wedding. Joe and George are made for each other. I didn't hesitate. Yes, we are. Clara's gaze softened, but the power behind it remained. Tom shifted in his seat, his confusion clear on his face. George set his utensils down.
Can I see your fortress?
Tom responded for her.
Of course, Clara wouldn't mind.
Clara's lips twitched, but she didn't argue. George stood, and Tom quickly followed.
I must join George.
As they disappeared into another hall, Clara's expression darkened. Now that you're all here, what do you think? This is great, isn't it? My throat felt dry. I'm sorry, Clara. I tried to avoid this, but George was desperate. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass. This Tom. He's been whispering things into George's ears. Before it's too late, finish him, or I will. A chill crept through me. I promise, neither George nor Tom will ever step foot in this fortress again. Clara's gaze hardened. If I see them near my fortress again, it will be their last day. I leaned forward. Please don't talk like that. I'll make sure George stays away. She stared at me for a long moment before exhaling. Go and see where they are. I didn't waste a second. As I stepped into the next hall, my breath caught. George and Tom stood close, their voices hushed. But the second they saw me, the conversation stopped. Something wasn't right. Tom, I said, keeping my voice light. Clara is looking for you. Tom flashed a smile and walked off. Once he was gone, I turned to George. So, what's going on? George's gaze lingered on the walls.
I remember this place. I remember these halls.
He hesitated.
And when I saw Clara today, she didn't feel like a stranger.
I inhaled sharply. She isn't a stranger. She's my best friend, and she's the queen. He didn't look convinced. Before I could say more, Clara appeared. Joe, let's go to our favorite place. I didn't hesitate. Yes, definitely. Tom, watching us, forced a smile.
See you soon.
Clara gestured to a guard. Take him to his room. Tom's smile tightened. As Clara and I walked, George's voice cut through the silence.
Clara, where is your husband? I haven't seen him in a long time.
Clara's lips barely moved. He's busy. George watched her closely before giving a small nod. Once we reached the garden, Clara's composure cracked. I can't handle this. Before I crush Tom, just get rid of him. I swallowed hard. I got it. I turned to find Tom, but then George was walking toward Clara. I followed quietly, pressing myself against the shadows. He spoke to her. She answered. And then Clara walked away. I stepped forward. What was he asking? Clara's expression didn't change. He asked about my husband, and then he said he remembered something was between me and him. She looked at me sharply. I told him we were only friends, but if he finds out the truth, you'll be destroyed too. My stomach twisted. What? Why me? Clara's voice was calm, but the warning was clear. Because you brought him here. Before I could respond, she smoothed her dress. Dinner is ready. At the table, George kept staring at Clara, and Tom, he kept staring at me. After the meal, I stood. Thank you for the dinner. We have to go. George pulled Clara into a hug.
We all love you, Clara.
She stiffened. I forced a smile. Good night, my bestie. But as we left, I could feel Clara's eyes burning into my back. The moment we stepped inside the house, Tom shut the door behind us, his face unreadable.
Dinner at my place is due,
he said casually. No, it's fine, I replied, forcing a smile, but something felt off. Tom took a slow step forward.
Joe?
I hesitated. Tom? He glanced at George, then back at me.
Do you want to tell us something?
My stomach tightened. George crossed his arms, his expression dark.
Yes, Tom. I think she might want to admit something.
A strange heat spread through my chest. What are you talking about? I asked. Tom sighed.
What do you think? You really believe George suddenly changed without reason?
He looked at George.
I saw George walking down the streets, dressed like a beggar. I asked him, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" He said he had lost his memory.
Tom turned back to me.
George asked me, how do I know him? And that's when I told him we were best friends from years.
George cut in, his voice low.
And then he showed me pictures.
Tom nodded.
And when he showed me your picture, George asked, "Do you know this woman?"
Tom's voice dropped, as if the next words tasted bitter.
And I told him, no.
Cold wave passed through me. I stayed still, but my fingers twitched against my sides. George's gaze pinned me down.
Then I asked him, "Who is my real wife?"
Tom inhaled sharply.
And I told him the truth. Clara is his wife.
The world blurred for a second. I stood frozen, my throat aching, but I didn't say a word. George took a slow step toward me.
Joe, you kidnapped me, didn't you?
The way he said my name, so cold, so distant, it was like a blade against my skin. No, never, I whispered. I loved you, since childhood. George's eyebrows drew together.
Excuse me? I don't know you. Tom doesn't know you. And you're telling me you've loved me since childhood?
Tom sneered.
George, don't let her fool you. She is a monster.
I took a shaky breath. I saved you. George's jaw clenched.
From who?
I met his eyes. Why didn't you ask your wife? Why isn't she accepting you? George scoffed.
She's scared of you. That's why she won't accept me. You did everything to avoid letting me see her?
Yes, I admitted. But for another reason. Tom's voice sharpened.
Joe, tell me the truth. What's your plan? You know I'm a strong werewolf.
I held my chin high. I don't have a plan. George stepped closer, his voice cutting through me.
I don't know what to believe.
He exhaled sharply.
But one thing I can't understand. When I asked Clara about our relationship, she denied. Why? Did you threaten her? Did you warn her that you will destroy her if she tries to reconnect with me?
Tom's face twisted.
Of course, she threatened her.
I clenched my fists. Can't you see? Clara doesn't want to accept you. George's gaze darkened.
I don't know what to believe. But one thing's clear. You are my enemy.
I stepped closer, my voice trembling but firm. No, I'm not. If I were, I would have destroyed you already. But I didn't. George shook his head.
Then tell me, what's going on?
I swallowed the lump in my throat. George, you're a good man now, but before your memory loss, you weren't. Silence. Then,
Excuse me?
Tom's voice sharpened.
What the hell are you talking about?
I inhaled deeply. It's the truth. Before you lost your memory, you weren't a good husband. You ignored Clara. You were cruel. More ruthless than you can imagine. She was a prisoner in her own home. So she made a choice. She would have destroyed you at the first chance she got. But then I requested her to spare you. She accepted my request, but she injected a medicine, and that's when you lost your memory. She planned this. She injected you with something to erase your memory. And now, I met George's stunned gaze. She's happier without you. George's hands curled into fists.
Lies, all lies. The truth is you kidnapped me for your own gain.
I swallowed the pain rising in my throat. Then go to Clara, see how she reacts. George's jaw tightened.
As I already told you, Clara won't accept me. She is scared of you.
She's not scared of me, I said. She's scared of you, of the man you were. And now, she loves someone else, and she deserves to be happy. George's face twisted.
No, you are trying to confuse me.
He took a step closer, voice low.
If you don't stop, we will destroy you.
I lifted my chin. When we were teenagers, we lived in the same pack. You were the Alpha King's son. I was the Beta's daughter, and I loved you, and you, my voice wavered. You loved me too. But as time passed, you changed. You became cruel. You became heartless. And then when I told you I was pregnant. George's breathing hitched. I forced myself to finish. You rejected me. Tom's eyes widened slightly, but George's face remained unreadable. My father rejected me, too, I whispered. I was nothing, a pregnant girl, no husband, no home. I lived in poverty because of you. My voice grew stronger. But when Clara told me what she had done, I promised her I would take care of you, and I did. George's hands shook. And now here we are, I continued. I've accepted you, because you are different now, but you have a choice. 3 choices, actually. 1, go back to Clara, but I promise you she will not take you back. 2, stay, be my husband, be a father to our children. Or 3, leave, live alone. Silence stretched between us. Tom exhaled.
George, if Joe's telling the truth, then you should stay. With her. With your children.
George's face remained hard.
I need to find the truth by myself.
I forced my voice to stay calm. I already told you the truth.
I want to see Clara.
I lifted my chin. If you go to her, I will never come back. My chest felt tight, but I ignored it. One last thing, I took money for this plan. George laughed dryly.
Wow, it's a deal and you call it love.
Yes, I'm selfish. I had to be. I didn't know if you would change or if you'd go back to your old ways, but one thing was certain. I would protect myself and my children. My voice dropped. If that makes me selfish, then so be it. George shook his head.
If I don't see Clara, how do I know you're not lying?
Can't you see? She doesn't want you, and can't you see how much I've fought to keep you? My voice cracked. Even when you didn't remember me, I loved you. I gave you everything, without expecting anything in return. Tom cleared his throat.
I'm just gonna wait outside.
He slipped out, leaving us alone. George's expression hardened.
Tell me something. How did you got pregnant? That day when you stepped out of the bathroom, you said you are pregnant. How did you?
My heart stopped. What? His voice was sharp.
You heard me. It's not mine, is it?
My breath caught. Excuse me? George's voice dropped lower.
It's another man's, isn't it?
Heat flared in my chest. Before I could stop myself, my hand struck his face. Hard, his head snapped to the side. Don't you dare, I hissed. His jaw clenched.
It's not mine.
Fury burned in my veins. I haven't been with anyone in 10 years. George's voice was ice.
You have...
Get out. My voice shook. Now. His gaze held mine for a long moment.
That day, I was checking you. Nothing happened between us that night.
What? Okay, I lied I wasn't pregnant, but I said so that you won't leave me again. Then without another word, he turned and walked away. And I let him, for now. I moved quietly through the shadows, keeping my steps light as I followed George and Tom. The night stretched endlessly ahead of us, the fortress looming in the distance. George walked with a determined pace, his shoulders squared, but I could tell from the way his fingers curled into fists that something was weighing on him. Tom beside him was silent, his gaze flicking left and right, sensing something I already knew. We weren't alone. I kept a safe distance behind them, waiting for the right moment. The second they neared the fortress gates, my body tensed. I took in a slow breath, feeling the shift inside me. My wolf stirred, eager, restless. Not yet. The fortress stood like a beast of stone, cold and unforgiving under the moonlight. Just as I prepared to shift, I caught sight of movement on the terrace. Clara. She stood at the edge, dressed in her usual Gothic black, her eyes gleaming like sharpened steel. From my place in the shadows, I could see the way her fingers tightened around the railing as she spotted George and Tom approaching. Then with a sharp snap of her wrist, she gave the order. Her army moved. 12 men, some in human form, others already shifting into their monstrous werewolf selves, rushed forward. I saw the moment Tom understood what was happening. His body tensed, and without hesitation he shifted. His form was huge, covered in dark fur, his muscles coiled with raw strength. He threw himself at them, but he was just one against many. I couldn't wait any longer. The transformation hit me like fire rushing through my veins. My body stretched, bones shifting, claws extending. Within seconds, I was on the move, silent as a shadow. I scaled the back of the fortress in a blur, my claws digging into the stone as I hoisted myself onto the terrace. Clara was still standing there, watching the fight unfold below with a smirk. She didn't see me coming. I crouched low, waiting. I could hear the chaos below, snarls, grunts, bodies hitting the ground. Tom was holding his own, but barely. I watched as 2 wolves tackled him, forcing him down. Enough. I leaped. The impact as I hit the ground sent dust and debris flying. I didn't hesitate. I lunged at the closest enemy, tearing through flesh, knocking them aside. One after the other, I took them down, the taste of battle thick in the air. By the time the last enemy fell, I turned and saw George. He was standing motionless, staring at me. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide. He'd never seen me like this. Not fully. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then softly, he whispered,
Joe.
Before I could respond, a slow clap echoed through the air. Clara. She had finally shifted, her form elegant yet deadly. She moved with the grace of someone who knew exactly how much power she held. Tom lunged first. It was a mistake. She caught him midair, twisting, sending him crashing into the ground with brutal force. His body hit the dirt with a sickening sound, a pained grunt escaping him. I barely had time to react before she turned her attention to George. She moved fast, too fast. I saw it. The way she readied herself to strike. The way her claws curved toward him, like she'd already decided he was done for. No, a growl ripped through me as I shot forward. Clara, no! She hesitated, her golden eyes narrowing. Then she tilted her head and smirked. Then I must destroy you first. I took a step forward, shaking my head. Clara, I don't want to fight you. She arched a brow. Then step aside. I can't. I exhaled slowly. You're not my enemy. Her expression twisted into something unreadable. For a second, I thought I saw hesitation flicker across her face, but then it was gone. But George is, she said. I held my ground. He's not the man he used to be. He's changed. Clara scoffed. You really believe that? I should have destroyed George that day. I shouldn't have given you a chance to save George. Before I could answer, George took a step forward. His voice was quiet but firm.
Clara, I am sorry.
He swallowed hard.
For everything.
Clara's lips pressed into a thin line.
I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve it. But I've spent every day since trying to be better.
He gestured toward me.
Because of her.
Something flickered in Clara's gaze. An old wound reopening. Then she laughed. Not a real laugh. A bitter one. Oh, George, she murmured. I don't want your apologies. I want this fortress, this wealth, and my lover, and if you stand in my way, I will destroy you. I stepped between them before she could move. Clara, wait, there's another way. Her eyes narrowed. A deal, I said. If you spare him, he'll walk away. He won't come back to claim the fortress. He'll sign it over to you. George turned to me, disbelief flashing across his face.
What?
George, I said evenly, don't be stupid. Say yes. Tom, still recovering on the ground, groaned.
For once, listen to Joe.
George looked torn, but then he sighed, rubbing a hand down his face.
Fine. I'll sign whatever you want.
Clara studied him for a long moment. Then with a small nod, she said, All right. It was over. Minutes later, we stepped inside the fortress. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust as George signed away his birthright. Clara watched in silence, her expression unreadable. When it was done, we left. The night felt quieter as we walked away. Then George stopped.
Joe.
I turned. He took a slow step forward, then another, and before I knew it, he was kneeling, my breath caught.
Will you marry me?
The world stilled. Tom let out a low whistle.
Well, damn.
George didn't look away from me.
Joe, I know I have messed up more times than I can count, but you are one thing in my life that is real, the only thing that matters.
He exhaled. I glanced at Tom. He shrugged.
Come on, Joe.
I looked back at George, and I smiled. I need time to think. George blinked. How much time? I hesitated. Then with a small smirk, I said, I don't know. His face fell. What? I stepped back, turning away, but before I walked off, I glanced over my shoulder, meeting his gaze. If you really love me, I murmured, then you'll find me again. And with that, I walked away, leaving behind a man who, for the first time in his life, finally understood what it meant to chase something real. But maybe one day we will claim George's fortress. Actually, our fortress. My heart sent me a good wife, maybe because I wanted him to feel the same suffers, which I did because of him. It is not a revenge, but I cannot compromise this much. Maybe one day if I realize that George is regretting his actions and he really loves me as much I had, then we will connect.